We've all heard in the news the frequency and severity of storms is increasing. But it's easy to lose sight of the risk of flooding during dry times, am I right? Resolving the flooding is your highest priority immediately following a flood. But as time goes by, the need for flood relief is no longer the top priority, and the cycle of flooding, repairs, and repeated flooding continues. If you are a city engineer or a public works director, you have probably seen this play out in your community. You know the areas of your community at risk of flooding, but there are never enough dollars in the community's budget to meet all of the needs. So each year, when going through your budget, you have to weigh fixing a drainage problem against fixing potholes, improving the water system, upgrading traffic signals, and all of the other improvements in your community. Not to mention the needs of the other departments like police and fire. All of these other needs are moved to the top of the list, and the drainage improvements that you know are needed continue to get pushed to the next year and the next year and the next year. I experienced this when I was a village engineer. It's hard to justify the cost of a flood relief project over all of the other needs, especially when it's dry. So the cycle continues. The solution that I have found to finally prioritize drainage projects, even when it's dry, is grant funding. By securing grant funding for your project, your community only needs to provide the local cost share. And the smaller amount is easier to budget. So you can finally complete that flood relief project, breaking the cycle of flooding, repairs, and repeated flooding. Wouldn't that be nice? Typically, FEMA provides 75% of the project cost, and the local share is then 25%, which would come from non-federal grants or other local funds. If you have a project identified where buildings will flood in a 100-year or smaller storm, inside or outside the regulatory floodplain, you have funding options like a FEMA Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant, also known as BRIC. And your project does not need to be millions of dollars to apply for FEMA funding. For example, I prepared a grant application for a $600,000 storm sewer project. The community had an intersection that floods in their downtown area that was outside the regulatory floodplain. The ponding gets so deep that the surrounding homes and businesses would flood. When calculating the benefit-cost ratio using FEMA software, having businesses that flood typically results in higher benefits for your project. So back to my example. The project only had 3 buildings that we could demonstrate were susceptible to flooding, but 2 of them were businesses. I analyzed the 3 buildings, and the project met FEMA's eligibility requirements. The community received $450,000 in grant funding, and the local cost share was then $150,000. It was much easier for the community to budget $150,000 than the full $600,000. Some communities won't submit a grant application if they think their project is too small to be considered, but actually the opposite is often true. Most grant programs will not offer a community less than the requested amount in their grant application. After all the applications have been ranked, if you are requesting more than they have remaining when they're making their selections, they'll move to the next application until they find a project that fits within the available funds. It's true that there is a threshold where it isn't really worth the effort to apply for funding and administer the grant. However, grant writing and administration costs are eligible for reimbursement, which helps lower that threshold. So if you have a flood relief project that needs funding, even if it's a small project, set up a chat with me to discuss your project and potential grant opportunities.